More like it. Hello guys, I'm Super Ron. Welcome back to the channel, and we're back in the G unit. But this week we've got a special guest in. I don't normally have other people's cars down here, but this is for a good friend of mine, and he's asked me to have a look at his 1991 Mark 1 Golf Caddy. So the Caddy is already converted when he bought it, and over the last few years he's done a little bit of tinkering around the car, making it a bit more usable. There's one little problem that he can't solve, and it's that the engine has a really hard time starting. So as you've seen from the channel, I've done many 20 valve turbo conversions, so there's lots of things I can check around the bay and just see how the conversion is done. This one is out of an Audi TT, and it's the BAM engine code, so it's the highest output variant 20 valve they did, and they have the bigger KO4 turbo and the larger injectors. So this is the one people love to go for out of the box, 225 horsepower and easily tunable. So I have done a little bit of tinkering on this before, because when he got it there was no diagnostic port on it, so I popped round to his house. They're really easy to wire in, it's just one wire to the ECU, and then we had an OBD port. We read the codes, there was loads of old codes already on there, but the one that stuck out to me was coolant temperature was open circuit. When there's no reading, they read -40, that's like their default. So on a normal day, it's gonna think the temperature's -14 and give it a really poor cold start. So I told him to get a new coolant temperature sensor, because that's the usual cause, but he's put that in and there's no different. Still doesn't start that well. The whole point of having these modern engines in classic cars is you don't have that classic car problem of wondering if it's gonna start on a cold morning. So we've ruled out the sensor, so I think it's going to be a bit of a wiring loom problem somewhere in this bay. So let's have a little look around the car and see what has been done. So like I said, this is the BAM engine. This is the one everyone wants because it came factory with the bigger turbo at the back and lots of other upgrades. Out of the factory, they're 225 horsepower. This one's probably a little bit more. So in this little Caddy, I'm sure that's a handful. So I can see it's had a hydraulic clutch conversion, and there's the clutch line down there. Looks kind of like a homemade conversion. I've just spotted the wiring under here, so we'll give that a close inspection. It's got a little fuse box, and this must be the main power fuse box. But everything seems to be there. Still running the standard diverter valve. Still got the heater matrix. I reckon this might be the main power. These BAMs are drive-by-wire, so it'll have a drive-by-wire pedal inside. It's got a nice big intercooler down there, and that is right in the grille. Boost pipes maybe a little bit questionable, but we'll just check them for boost leaks. But overall, it's a really cool car. It's still got the original Caddy clocks, so there's no rev counter. So he's got a little rev counter down there, a few more gauges. So I think I'll just plug it back in and read the codes, and then have a little bit more investigation into the wiring, because I remember when I put the OBD port in, it did look a little bit questionable in places. So I'll give that a double check over. I'll ring the coolant temperature sensor wires to the ECU, because I'm suspecting there's a break in the wire now we've got a new sensor in. But overall, looks a pretty tidy homemade conversion. So let's take this engine cover off and double check he has got a BAM and hasn't been sold the dream. This is all the right pipe work for an Audi TT. So it looks hopeful, but we'll be able to see straight away, written on the cylinder head. And yeah, there we have BAM. And our coolant temperature gauge should be just in there. That's the plug. So he's put a new sensor in. So now I'm a little bit suspicious of the wiring. And just have a look around. Looks like it's got the reverse wire cut off. So I'm just going to give it a full check over of the loom, because he just wants it to be as reliable as possible. Have a little look in this fuse box. As long as that's watertight, that'll do the job. And carry on. So inside, I've just took the lower trim off. And here is the OBD port that I wired in. I can see he's got this drive-by-wire pedal in there. And the internal hydraulic clutch conversion. All in there nice. So let's plug the OBD reader in and see what code it gives us. Right, so I've got the Bluetooth adapter in. I've just got the Torx app on my phone. Really handy, lets you read all the live data and all the fault codes stored on the ECU. So if we turn the ignition on, that's something else that could do with changing. The fuel pump is on ignition live, so it's running all the time. Really, that should be controlled by the ECU. Because if you have a fuel line split, the engine will stop and the engine will tell the ECU relay to stop, which then stops the pump. But as this is, the pump is continuously running, not ideal. So I might hook that up to the ECU feed instead of ignition. Let's have a look for codes. Straight away, engine coolant temperature, high circuit. So this might not be the whole problem, but it's definitely not helping with the cold start. The engine needs to know what temperature it's at, and having that fuel pump running is also not helping things. And so that is all it is holding. Coolant temperature circuit. So let's try and give this a start and see what it's actually doing, because he says sometimes it can go on for some time and it'll just splutter and backfire into life. But once it's running, it's fine. Right, let's see if it'll burst into life. So being a modern car, it should just fire straight up. So when it is actually running, it seems to run really nicely. I'm just looking at the live data here, and we've got coolant temperature minus 40 degrees to try and clear the codes. So now we've got a few more codes. Fuel pump primary circuit, open circuit, because I haven't connected that up. EVAP emission control, that's because it hasn't got the carbon canister. And another pending fault, camshaft position sensor A, circuit range performance, which is the cam sensor. So I'll just have a little look into the wiring next. So here's the wiring diagrams on ELSA Win, and here is our coolant temperature sender, the G62 and G2. G2 is for the coolant gauge, so that just goes to earth, and this one goes to the gauge on the clocks. G62 is for the ECU, so that comes in at pin 93 to pin 3 on the plug. So let's check that out. So 97, 96, 95, 94, 93. Let's see if we have continuity. So here to here, beep, here to here, no beep. So I think that is our problem. So I'll take the back of the plug off and see what we've got. So a bit more digging, and I took the back of the ECU plug off so I could get to the wires just to check it wasn't a pin problem, and found our coolant wire, but it still doesn't ring out to our sensor. So I started taking the loom out, and the strange thing is this goes into the original Mark 1 loom. So where the coolant temperature sender goes in, this is the original Mark 1 engine loom, which doesn't seem to connect to the TT loom. So it might be that they've never actually connected this up. So I'm just going to unwrap this, see if we've got the wire in, and if we have, that needs to be connected to the ECU. So somewhere in the engine loom is the other end of this wire. If I can find that just dangling around, hanging out, I can connect this one straight up to it, and that will be job done. If not, I'll just run a wire from the plug straight to the ECU. But if I can find it, that'll save me a lot of work. We've got a few spare here all coiled up, and that's in the right area. I think it should be in this loom higher up. What's this plug? Bingo! That is a coolant temperature plug. Let's see if that rings out. The other thing that puzzled me when I was ringing out is pin 3 on this is a blue and white wire, whereas on the wiring diagrams it should be grey and green. At the ECU end we've got a grey and green, and I've just noticed on this coolant plug on pin 3 we have got a grey and green. I'm feeling pretty hopeful about this. Right, if we try this again with a new plug, so we'll put our probe in pin 3, try it on here, and we should have a beep. So that is the plug for the coolant temperature sender. This is one they've put in just for the gauge only. And just to double check that the coolant gauge is connected, I've just earthed the yellow red, which is to the gauge, put that to earth, and when a sender is earthed out, the gauge goes to max. So now I'll put the ignition on, the coolant gauge should go all the way to max. There it goes, so that's connected, so that's a good sign. I did wonder whether it's left down here because it's too short, because the gauge is actually on the top there, but it's part of this loom up here. So if we can wiggle that past the coolant hoses, that reaches the loom there. So we just need to swap the plugs, because this is the later one, but they do exactly the same job. So I've just got to put this plug on the end of this loom. Unfortunately, I can't just de-pin it because these are bigger terminals. That would have been a nice little touch. So I'll have to join the wires. And there we are, swapped over to the new plug. The one wire we've got left is for the coolant gauge itself, which is this one, which goes into the BAM loom. And normally that goes all the way around. And then when it meets to the car, there's a whole load of these plugs. And that's where the car loom meets the engine loom. So usually you connect the wire coming out of the other one of these plugs up to your clocks. But the rest of these have all been cut off and got rid of. So as we've got the wire here coming out of the Mark 1 loom, I'm just going to put that back to its plug. And then we can get rid of these other earths, they're not needed. And then we can get rid of this one, and this will be our actual coolant plug. It's got the fuel pump wire, the ignition live now in the box. Now I'm just putting the fuel pump feed in with a fuse. And when joining the big wires, instead of a massive solder, I've managed to get the proper crimps that they use in the factory looms. So they all sit in there much better, completely solid. And then shrink that down and then put that into the box as well. So now I've relocated the fuel pump relay into this box here. So when the lid's on, that'll all be tucked away, so we're not sitting up here anymore. And I've put a fuse in it now, which is quite the novelty, because there's no fuse at all for the fuel pump. Also, it is on an ignition live, so that ran all the time, and it's actually run off this wire over here, and this is the old plug for the carbon canister. So it used the ignition live for the carbon canister. There's the signal wire, which isn't used, and that ran all the way across, and that turned on the relay, and then it's just a direct power from the battery to the relay and then to the fuel pump. Whereas now we're fused, and the fuel pump is controlled by the ECU. So it goes up here, and it's this purple and white wire that triggers the fuel pump relay. So that only puts it on when you want it. So now you haven't got it running all the time like it was. So now everything's working, we can tape all this up and make it look a little bit more tidy. Right, let's find out whether we've got coolant temperature sender. We are reading coolant temperature now. So we've got 25 degrees. Let's check the fault codes. So all we've got now is evaporative emission control system, purge control valve circuit open. That's just because we haven't got a carbon canister, so that's no biggie. And the only one that keeps coming up is camshaft position sensor A out of range / performance. That one keeps coming up, and that kind of makes me think that this is a bit more than an electrical problem. Like there's something wrong with the timing. So what he's saying is a correlation between the crankshaft sensor at the bottom and the camshaft at the top aren't lining up where they should be. So I think I need to see what the situation with the timing is. I'll whip the cam belt cover off and have a look, see if I can see the timing marks and if anything looks untoward. Okay, so looking more into this cam sensor, why it's out of range. This is the cam sensor here. I've just checked the voltages to the plug because it's a 5 volt sensor and it's got its 5 volts and its earth. So that seems to be okay. So what I need to do really is check the timing of the cam belt, because I can see it's definitely had a new water pump and a new timing belt. It's not easy to check the timing on these because as you can see there's not a lot of room down there, and to check the bottom pulley, this one's actually been made better because this bottom panel should come straight across there. So someone's given it a little access hole to be able to get to that, which is super handy for me. But you can't quite see where the timing marks are very easily on these. You can see the top one, see there's a little bit of Tipex there and a line there, but I need to find out if that lines up with the crank, which is not easy to see. So like we saw on the Scirocco, a problem we have on Mark 1 and Mark 2 conversions is they have the little bung in the gearbox which comes out, and then the flywheel, which you might be able to see, you can just see the flywheel down there, just there. But with these O2J conversions, they don't have the correct flywheel, so they don't have the mark at top dead center. And here's what the timing should look like. So we've got the top pulley with its little mark, and on the flywheel, there should be a notch that lines up with that pointer, which we haven't got. So we're gonna have to go old school again, like we did on the Scirocco, and I've just taken all the spark plugs out, and we'll put our socket down. We'll put it down on number 1 so we can see when the piston comes up to the top and then goes back down again. And when we find it on the rock, we'll know when the piston is at the top. So we'll try and get down number 1, turn the engine over by hand and see if we can find the true top dead center, and then see where our marks line up. All right, so here's our little pointer. If I rotate the engine now, that should go down with the piston and back up. So we've just got to find the rock where it doesn't move anymore, which I think is just there. And that does now line up with that little line on the crank pulley being in line with that little Tipex mark on the case. And here's those 2 little marks on the picture, which do line up, which is a good sign. Which means the bottom end is all fine. The pulley hasn't spun, but up here, I think we have a problem. This little Tipex mark here should be aligned with this Tipex mark in the cover. So it should be this tooth here. So the cam belt has slipped around. So we've got to find out if it's been timed up wrong, or whether the belt is a bit on the loose side. Oh, actually, yeah. Yep. That should not be able to do that. So I think this could probably pop off. That is not ideal. Bolt for that looks tight, so the tensioner looks like it's alright. I think I'll take this bottom pulley off and just double check there's no carnage in there. So I'd say this has turned into a little bit more than a quick wiring job. The timing being out that far would make sense because the overlap of the valves isn't right, which is why it backfires through when you're trying to turn it over. When it does get started, it runs fine, but we're about 2 teeth out here, and these are a 5 valve head. So there's 3 inlet valves, and they do get close to the piston. So I think we're gonna have to run a compression test on it, but I have a feeling that is okay because it did run fine. But he's been driving it around like this all this year, so I think he better go and buy a lottery ticket. So first of all, I'm going to check if the tensioner bolt is tight. Right, on the manual tensioner conversion, this bolt should be 45 Newton meters. So that's what I've got to set the torque wrench to, and let's see if it is. Yeah, see? Yeah, tensioner is still tight. So I just took the bottom cover off and everything looks okay here. Again, the thing I was a bit worried about was this spinning on the crank, which does happen. But this line here has to be lined up with that little nub there, which is perfectly, which means the crank and the bottom pulley is okay. So we are bang on there, but we are a long way off. Now I've got that dead on, we are, I'd say it's got to be there. I think we're 2 whole teeth out, less than ideal. That's the belt off. It's all quality stuff. It's got a Gates kit, INA tensioner. It's got the proper spacer on the rear. All the threads and everything look okay in there. It's got a Epitech mount kit, so it's got a decent mount kit on it. Water pump's tight. Bearings haven't gone in that. Are we just dealing with the cam belt wasn't done up tight enough and it's just slipped? Can't find any problems. Okay, so I've got the belt back on and I've just tensioned it up. We've got our marks at the bottom lined up. Got our marks at the top lined up. So before we got our white dot here, we were 2 teeth this way. So now I'm just going to give it 2 rotations and check everything's timed up. Lined up at the bottom and we're lined up at the top. Belt's fine, so we'll torque that up. So we're all timed up, lines are marked, the bottom pulley's back on. I think we are going to do a compression test just to make sure we've got all the spark plugs out so it's nice and easy. I thought these were quite a tight engine, but perhaps they can get away with 2 teeth out. Right, let's try number 1. Perfect. Perfect. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. So that is one big relief. We've got 190 to 200 PSI across all four. Means it's a nice healthy engine. So I think let's put it back together and give it a try. Okay, everything's back in and plugged in. Let's just clear all the codes, because that would have thrown one up from the compression test. Connected. Search for codes. Codes are all cleared. Let's go for a start up. There. Fire straight up. Let's try again. Straight up. Okay, so we're back on a new day. I left everything fine yesterday, but I just wanted to see what it's like on a cold start, because it's especially bad when the engine was cold. But now the ECU knows what temperature it is, and the crankshaft and the camshaft are now in time. So this should start up just like a modern car. Perfect. Problem solved. That's what a modern engine conversion in a classic car should be like. You turn the key and it fires straight up. So now the fuel pump is controlled by the ECU. It doesn't run all the time. It should just prime when you took the ignition on. Prime. Start. So let's take this out for a little spin. Right, let's take this out for a little spin just to check everything's okay. When we drove down here, I could tell there was something not quite right. I've driven a lot of Mark 120 valves, and you could tell this just didn't have the boost. That's because the valves were opening at the wrong time. They're opening too early, so it wasn't even getting its full compression stroke. Now we should have all the boost. It's sounding good. Making about 14 PSI. It's holding boost nicely. It's holding about 11, 12. This is more like it. That's more like it. Just a bit too bumpy to be able to do anything. This is what a BAM should feel like. I think he's going to be quite surprised when he picks this up. Just give it a quick check under the bonnet. Feel it's great. So, fires up perfectly, just like a brand new car. So let's get this back to the workshop, last few trims on, and get it back to the owner. So that's all the trims and covers back on, and I'm going to officially say this one is done. So that certainly escalated in a lot more than a little bit of a wiring problem, but he is so lucky. I can't believe even with 2 teeth out, the valves didn't hit. Sometimes even just 1 tooth out can lead to disaster. Some of the wiring in the conversion does leave a little bit to be desired, but it is all working now. His original intention of this Caddy was to use it as an engine conversion for his Scirocco, being the Mark 1 bay. Everything would just bolt out and go straight into a Scirocco. So if he does do that, I'll redo the whole loom just so it's a nicer install. But for now, everything worked, and he can go back to enjoying it and not sitting there like a classic car owner, just turning it over, backfiring, turning it over, backfiring, nearly starting. But now it is running better than it ever has. And as you've seen, it's an absolute flyer. So the other way we could have done things, instead of chopping the plug off the BAM loom, we could have got an actual BAM sensor, because that would have gone in the hole and plugged straight in. The problem with that is the modern sensors don't read correct with the old analog Mark 1 clock. There are resistors and converters you can get in, but this was the best way to work with what what we've got and get it all back up and running. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. We don't normally have guests here in the G unit, but this is something I know inside and out, so I know whatever was wrong, it was not going to be too bad. So until next time, make sure you have fun.